How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I saw these dragon bones at my local hobby store. I thought it was kind of funny that this company made such a great effort to let us know that these were bones. I thought that was fairly obvious just by looking at them. I removed all of the bones from their box, and then I began assembly. And just like it said on the box, it was easy to assemble. Although once it was assembled, it had a hard time staying together. I suppose it's probably because you're supposed to use glue. But that's okay, because I'm not going to have it in a museum skeleton pose, but rather a dead and where we found it skeleton pose. I laid out the pieces on a board that I'll be using for the base, and I arranged them how I thought a dragon might look if it had fallen from the sky. Because some of the bones don't lay naturally, I had to do a little bit of snipping with my nippers, and then I heated up other parts of the skeleton with my heat gun. I then pressed down on those warmed up sections ever so slightly and held them till they were cool. I then glued all the pieces together into their final resting position, and I moved on to some XPS foam to create a little bit of altitude variation on the terrain. After cutting out a few shallow hills, I glued them in place around the dragon using some foam-safe superglue. I then removed the dragon, and I set it aside for a few minutes, and it was time to cover the wooden base and all of the foam with some Sculptamold. I grabbed a couple handfuls of Sculptamold, poured in my water, and I mixed it up till it was one even consistency. Then I slapped it on the board to give it some nice earthy texture. And while that was still wet, I stuck the dragon back in place, working it into the mud so it looked like it had been there for a little while. And once the dragon had been tucked in, I began mixing up a second terrain paste, starting with plaster. After cleaning up the spilled plaster, I threw in some Mod Podge, water, and paint. I also mixed in some fine ballast to give it some extra texture, and once mixed, I smeared it all over the base and over parts of the dragon as well to help further sell the idea that this dragon had been there for quite some time. I used some isopropyl alcohol and a little brush to make sure I did not lose too much detail, then I set that aside to dry fully, and I cleaned up my hobby mat. To be clear, this diorama is not supposed to be historically accurate. I made a diorama last year of some cowboys fighting over dinosaur bones, and I wanted to create something similar in a parallel monster-infested medieval Europe. As I was unboxing this box of Vikings, I couldn't help but notice this guy, who looked like he might have just escaped from Shawshank. Unfortunately, they didn't have the Andy Dufresne Viking in the actual box of miniatures, but they did have a nice variety to choose from. After prepping the Vikings, I broke out my box of Swiss halberdiers, followed by some crested knights. I will say that they're from England. Finally, a group of French Knights Templar. I thought it would be funny for the battle to have the halberdiers paired up with the Templars and the Vikings with the crested knights. These are some short and fragile little alliances formed for the sake of capturing some dragon bones. After throwing all the minis on some painting bases, I began priming. And while I paint these, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons, as well as tell a little story about this diorama. Like I mentioned a minute ago, I made a diorama very similar to this one a year ago in the Wild Imaginary West, with a bunch of cowboys fighting over some dinosaur bones. I really enjoyed making that diorama, so when I saw a dragon skeleton in the D&D section at my local hobby store, I got inspired to recreate the scene, but in medieval imaginary Europe, which doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Anyway, ever since Medieval Living published an article about dragon skulls being the best way to decorate your great hall, kings and lords across Europe have paid ridiculous amounts of money to get their hands on them. As we all know, dragons don't die very often, so when their carcasses are discovered, it creates quite a frenzy. In this case, the Knights Templar made an agreement with the Swiss that if they helped them secure the skull, they would return the favor at some point. Doesn't seem quite fair, but having the Knights Templar owe you a favor, I guess, is worth a lot. The Vikings made an agreement with these knights that they could keep the skull as long as they let them take the rest of the skeleton. Both the knights and the Vikings do plan on turning on each other as soon as the halberdiers and Templars are taken care of. After the painting was done, it was time to bring back my bone-dry dragon and terrain. I wanted to have the static grass on the diorama before painting so I could control the color of the grass, so I whipped out some static tack, my static grass applicator, and I went to town. After all of the static tack had been covered by static grass, I broke out a sock and a vacuum to collect the excess, which I was able to store and save for later. Once the glue had fully dried and I knew the grass was not going anywhere, I was able to prime the whole thing black. I then broke out the airbrush again and began layering up the earthy colors of the earth and the bony colors of the bones. As many times as I've painted landscapes, I often make the same mistake, and that's to add too much of my highlight color. The only thing that really needed it in this case was the bones and the little rock behind the left wing. In this case, I had to go back and fix a few things to make the earth look natural again. At this point, the dragon's bones looked far too pristine, and they needed some grime, so I broke out an oil wash and gave the bones a nice dirty wash. I then removed the oil wash from all the high points using a paper towel, and I added a layer of dust. And I actually think it looked better at this point than it does afterward. I don't know why I kept adding stuff, but I did. I added some flocking, which doesn't look terrible, but not as good as it did before, in my opinion. With the landscape done, it was time to install all of my little soldiers. I probably went a little overboard with the number of soldiers that I tried to pack into this diorama, but I guess it captures some of the chaos of medieval warfare. Either way, the last step was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 4.0, and after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.